Hey guys, in this video I want to go over some safety procedures for the welding class. Now this is going to cover everything from welding, grinding, cutting, all of that, all that's in between. So let's get started. Let's talk about fires. Yeah, you probably guessed it. Welding is probably the most common causes of fires in some manufacturing environments or some shops. Some companies have even started having all their workers fill out hot work permits when they're going to do any welding or cutting. These actually aren't that bad. Most of the time they require them to get a fire extinguisher or possibly get some covers put up so that way nobody gets exposed to light, things like that. But let's get right back to fires. Now, let's say we had an ignition source such as welding. Could be plasma cutting, could be grinding, could be like oxyacetylene torches. All that stuff are considered an ignition source. Now, if we also had something that was considered a combustible, paper, woods, gas, anything, petroleum products, anything like that, we need to talk about a distance away. How far away does all that stuff need to be? Well, we need to have 25 feet from the ignition source, so from here, 25 feet in between these papers or whatever that combustible is. Now, if we can't get 25 feet, we could still, do the hot work, but there's some requirements. We need to make sure that we have a fire watch. That fire watch needs to stay on duty after the ignition source is put out for at least another 30 minutes. Now, if you're going to be on a fire watch, you're going to need to know something about fire extinguishers and how to use them. So we're going to talk about the pass technique. We're also going to talk a little bit about fire extinguishers themselves. Now, fire extinguishers come in either an A, B, C, or D fire extinguisher. Now, you can also get a combination fire extinguisher, which is an A, B, C fire extinguisher. Now, an A, B, C fire extinguisher is good for things like paper and wood. It's going to things like gas and paint. Also, it's going to have computer and electrical fire type products. It's a lot more popular to get a combination fire extinguisher rather than a singular fire extinguisher. In fact, I think I've seen one or two in my whole lifetime. So all the fire extinguishers we're going to be using here are ABC fire extinguishers, and they are commonly located around the shop, so that way you can easily get them. Sometimes on a fire watch, you need to make sure you have those in your hands or within a few feet. So, but it depends on the rule for your particular workplace. Now, the pass technique is what you're going to do when you're actually needing to put out a fire. It stands for pull, aim, squeeze, and sweep. Now, for the P, we're going to pull the pin on that fire extinguisher. We're going to aim it at the base of that fire, and then we're going to squeeze the trigger, slowly squeeze the trigger, because if you just pull it hard, it's going to jerk back on you. And then we're going to sweep. So we're just going to work our way back and forth over that fire. So let me go ahead and demonstrate that with a fire extinguisher. All right, so I got my fire extinguisher. A few things I want to point out on the fire extinguisher are there is a label right here on the front that actually says it's an A, B, or C fire extinguisher, and it even gives you a pictogram of what those things might be and what this fire extinguisher can fight. Another thing I want to point out is this valve up here. Notice that this valve is in the green. Maybe you need to take a look at ours. It's kind of starting to get to the edge. That means it's still good. You always want to make sure, when you do your walk-arounds and do your safety checks, that this is in the green. If not, it needs to get replaced. And remember, this tag right here is what's going to tell us that it's been safety inspected for the year. One cool thing is it actually has the pass instructions right here written on the side in case you forgot them. But let's go over them really quickly, just to make sure. Now you see this pin right here. The first thing you're going to do is you're going to pull out that pin for the pull on pass. You're going to break this plastic band right here, and that's what's going to let it come out. The next thing you're going to do is you're going to aim this nozzle towards the fire. We're going to go ahead and we're going to squeeze down this handle, and we're going to be sweeping side to side at that point. So we're going to aim at the base of the fire, squeeze, and then we're going to sweep across the fire and kind of put it out. Now, another thing you're going to want to remember is after you've used that fire extinguisher, it needs to be replaced. Even if it's partially discharged, it needs to be replaced. You need to get a new one. Don't keep those things around. You never know, and you want to make sure you have something that's going to work. Now, let's move on to some bottle storage. Now we have two different types of bottles. We're going to have oxygen or an inert gas such as any welding gas, the 70-25s, 90-10s, those kind of mixtures, argon, things like that are not combustible. And then we're going to have our acetylene type gases, or acetylene or propane are pretty much what's going to be in that side. Now, we can't store these types of bottles together, but we can put a 30-minute burn wall in between them. And now also we need to make sure that those bottles are secured. Often you'll go into a bottle rack or something like that, and they're going to be chained up. So you want to make sure that these bottles, number one, cannot fall over in any way, possibly get damaged or get the valves knocked off them. You want to make sure that you have a 30-minute burn wall in between them, or you can have 25 feet or more. Acetylene has to be stored in the upright position. The reason for that is acetylene is very volatile. I believe it's anything over 15 psi is actually considered dangerous line pressure. So what they do is they put acetone inside the bottle because most of the time an acetylene bottle it has 350 to 400 psi in it. So they put acetone in there as a neutralizer. That way, if something did happen, it got knocked or fell over, it wouldn't blow up. But if you set it on its side, acetone is actually heavier than acetylene. So that acetone will come up to the top of the tank if it's laid on its side. What happens is acetone is actually corrosive to petroleum products. So the things that are found in all the seals in your regulator and the hoses, so if any of that acetone gets out of that bottle into those hoses, it'll immediately eat through it, and then you'll have a pretty bad leak of acetylene. After it's been laying on the side, you set it upright. It still takes hours for that acetylene to go back to the bottom of the tank. So what you want to do is just either never store them on the side, or if it has been on its side, you want to make sure to give it at least a few hours, if not a day or so, to let it kind of re-neutralize or let the acetylene come back to the top of the tank and the acetone to go to the bottom. All right, now let's move on to burns. Burns are the #1 accident that happens in weld shops. These things can happen to either your skin or to your eyes, depending on what kind of things you're exposed to and what PPE you wore or didn't wear. So let's go ahead and let's talk about the 3 different types of burns you can get. So there's 1st degree, 2nd degree, and 3rd degree burns. Now, a 1st degree burn would be like a severe sunburn. So if you were standing next to somebody welding, you might receive a 1st degree burn. It's going to go away in a couple days, something not too serious. Probably won't need to see medical attention or anything like that. Now, a 2nd degree burn would actually have some visible damage. It's going to have things like blisters, possibly bleeding, but probably not quite that bad. And this is something that we're going to want to get some medical attention. We're going to want somebody to look at it because some things with burns are a little bit more delicate than other type of cuts or scrapes and things like that. Now, a 3rd degrees are a very bad burn, and we're going to definitely want to get that looked at. It's going to have actually some burned skin, some charring, bleeding. You're not going to probably feel it. All of these things can very easily happen with the welding process. Now, there's 3 types of light. You got ultraviolet light, infrared, and visible light. Now, this ultraviolet light is probably the most dangerous. These waves, you can't feel them, you can't see them, you don't know that they're happening. So you can get a 1st and 2nd degree burn just from the light waves of ultraviolet. Now, infrared lights are felt as heat. So these are actually the easiest one to protect ourselves from. It's if we're standing there, somebody's welding, you can actually feel the heat off that light. You're actually feeling an infrared light. So this one's really easy. Get covered up, wear the proper protection for these ones. Now, visible light would be the actual light coming off of a light bulb. You can see it. Your flashlight, things like that. That's a visible light. Now, visible light is got some bad parts to it too. These are the kind of things that cause night blindness. It can cause strain to your eyes. That's all visible light. Now, I want to quickly go over some safety topics, especially for your eyes. You want to make sure that you're wearing at minimum a shade 10 every time you're welding, up to a shade 12, depending on what welding process you're doing. Also, you should never have any skin exposed. you should either be covering up with a little bit heavier fabric. If you have a really light fabric, then the light can actually travel through the fabric and burn you. All right, projectiles. Now, the most popular way to make projectiles is probably going to be from grinding. So we need to talk about your protection and then the protection of other people. So for you, we're going to have to make sure that we always have our safety glasses on whenever we're out in the shop. Safety glasses are a must always. Second thing, if you are using the grinder, you want to make sure that you are wearing a face shield. There are some other PPE things such as gloves and hearing protection, but as far as projectiles are concerned, the face shield is most important. Now, the other thing I want to say about it is you are directing the stream of sparks if you are grinding. So if you are out on a table, make sure that you're not spraying it inside of a booth. Make sure that you're not inside of a booth grinding very much. I know sometimes you have to grind those tables and that's a little bit difficult to do, but you don't want that sparks to be bouncing around and then going up underneath your face shield or down your shirt or something like that. You want to try to be out in the open if you're going to be grinding. Like I said, make sure you're not spraying it at somebody else. Make sure that you're not spraying it at somebody else that doesn't know, because that could potentially get on their clothes and even light or burn their clothes. That's kind of just the quick and dirty on projectiles. Just be careful where you're shooting those projectiles. If you're doing things like cutting or plasma cutting, make sure that you have a nice clean space for all those sparks to be going out. Make sure that there's no fire hazards around. Otherwise, you should be covered on projectiles. All right, hearing damage. Now, there's two main ways to cause hearing damage in a weld shop. One, grinding. Grinding runs about 120 to 130 decibels, depending on the metal that you're grinding on. If you're going to be grinding, you need to make sure that you have hearing protection in at all times. If you're around somebody grinding, you need to make sure you're wearing hearing protection. Now, the second thing that could happen is MIG welding. MIG welding is kind of a louder, higher pitched welding process. Over time, people who are like lifelong MIG welders will actually lose their hearing because of that noise. So if you're going to be exposed to MIG welding for a long period of time, you should also be wearing some hearing protection. More than likely, none of the classes at Tooele Tech are going to have you welding long enough to really do some permanent damage, but if you get out into the field, it might be a good thing to know. All right, so I also wanted to take a second and show you guys how to put in the plug style hearing protection. I personally like the plug style hearing protection because it fits under your welding hood and you can wear it at all times. So a plug style that we have are going to look something like this. What you're going to do is you're going to take your fingers, make sure your hands are clean. You don't want dirty hands when you're doing this. You're going to scrunch it up. I just kind of spin it around in my fingers until it looks something like this, nice and small. Next thing I do is I kind of tilt my head back to the side and I just kind of push it in to my ear canal. And then over time, about 30 seconds, it will expand. Some people will have to pull their ear to get their ear canal to open. I just have a little bit larger ear canals, I guess, and I don't have to do that. But if it's not getting all the way in or you're not noticing a definite difference in your hearing, make sure that you're trying to pull on your ear or whatever to open that ear canal. Now, these are disposable plugs, one use every time, okay? So we are really big about wearing hearing protection. It's kind of like my thing. So if you need a new set, throw them away, get a new set. It's not a big deal. All right, fumes. Now, there's quite a bit of fumes that come off welding. There's some that are a lot more harmful than others. Honestly, any fumes that you are breathing in are potentially harmful. So even though stick welding might not be so bad, while if you're welding on stainless steel, aluminum, or even stick or MIG, it lets off a gas called chromium. Also, if you're welding to something that is galvanized, that's going to let off a lot of gases that could be potentially bad for your lungs and your body. So in our shop, what we've done is we have a ventilation system over every booth. You want to try to make sure that your parts are positioned as close to underneath that hood as possible, so that way none of it's going up and you're breathing it in. To make sure it's turned on, it's pretty evident by the sound, but the red switch is located outside of the classroom, and you should be able to put your hand kind of underneath it and feel a little bit of a suction. So make sure there's a dampener that you can turn it on and off, so make sure that's not turned off either. All right, electrical shocks are another very common thing that happens around the classroom, I guess. And most of the time this is happens from either sweating or you get your gloves wet when you're quenching something. What I would suggest doing is making sure you're using a pair of pliers when you're putting hot items in the quench tank. Again, if you're getting really overheated, maybe you need to switch to a jacket that's a little bit more light and breathable, or maybe we need to open a door, something like that. But really, if you stay dry, pretty much I would not worry about getting shocked at all. All right, so I'd like to wrap this video up by just going over the PPE. We've talked about a lot of the dangers and some of the stuff we could do to stay away from those dangers, but we should also talk about the PPE required in the weld shop. Now, anywhere inside of the shop, you're required to have your safety glasses on. This is no different in the weld shop. It doesn't matter if you're wearing a face shield or welding hood, you need to have your safety glasses on. The next thing is long pants. Long pants are required everywhere in the shop too. We want to make sure that they are 100% cotton. They're not going to melt or get burned through by any of the slag or spatter that we're having when we're welding. That's maybe more of a special thing for the weld shop. Last thing would be our boots. We need to make sure that we're wearing leather boots. I would highly recommend they are ones that do not have laces that are exposed. That way, if the hot metal or sparks land on your shoes, they just kind of bounce off, as opposed to getting on those laces and melting them or lighting them on fire. Now that's just kind of the basis. Everybody should have that on all the time. Now I want to start adding our specific welding gear. First thing would be our welding hood. Now I've already talked about for our eye protection, we want to make sure that we're getting a minimum of a shade 10 up to a shade 12. Some of the wire feed processes, we want to make sure we're at a shade 12. Also, when you're cutting, you want to make sure that you're using either a shade 3 or a shade 5 when you're running that oxy torch. Few other little things might be you want to make sure that you have something on your head on top of wearing the hood. Sometimes BBs or hot BBs will bounce onto your head and it'll get into your hair. So either flip your hat backwards or you can buy a specific welding cap for that. Also, we want to make sure that there's no light reflecting around inside of our hoods. Sometimes this happens, so you just want to try to decrease that as best you can. Usually it's if you're wearing a white shirt or something like that, it'll reflect into the hood. Next, let's talk about our gloves. So our gloves are a leather gauntlet style glove. The reason that they're leather gauntlet style is so that they come down past your wrist over here. Now, what happens is your shirt will go all the way to your wrist, and we want to try to protect that zone as best as possible, because that's where a lot of times hot slag or BBs will get down into. So make sure that they have a gauntlet style glove to them and they're all leather. The last thing is going to be our welding jacket. And again, we want to make sure that we can button it all the way up. It's got a tight fit around our neck so that no slag or BBs or hot spatter can get down in there. And we want to make sure that its long sleeve comes pretty far down our wrist. Like I said, that wrist area is kind of where a lot of stuff will sneak in. Otherwise, there's no other specific welding gear. I mean, we can be wearing our hearing protection if necessary. If you guys have any questions or anything you'd like to go over or specific concerns, please let me know.